Hi there. So in this video, we want to start talking about combining geometry and algebra. So to understand what's going on in this video, you need to be familiar with the geometry formulas that I had in my last video to do with area and perimeter and volume. All right, but we're just going to start combining the ideas with using these formulas to solve some related problems that require some algebra to do. All right, so let's just look at an example problem here. So let's say a rectangle has a perimeter of 600 feet and a width of 50 feet. Okay, and then I want to know what its length is. All right, and so you need to have familiarity with the formulas that we talked about. So we're talking about a rectangle and its perimeter. All right, I didn't really write that very clearly, did I? Well, hopefully you heard it as I was saying, but that was some sloppy writing there. Okay, and so we're talking about the perimeter of a rectangle. All right, and so we mentioned that formula last class, or you could look it up. So remember, there's different formulas for different shapes and depending on what kind of thing we're talking about. So we're talking about perimeter of a rectangle, all right? And so if you remember that formula, it's P equals 2L plus 2W. All right, so we have this setup right here. Now, what the key thing is, we need to know what we're given and what we're trying to find, okay? And so we're given that the perimeter is 600 feet, all right? And so we have that the perimeter is equal to 600, not 200, like that. And what else are we given? We're given that the width is 50 feet, all right? And so we're given that W is equal to 50 feet. And now what are we trying to find? We're trying to find the length. The question asks what's its length. So we're trying to find L. So what we can do is we can take that formula like that, and then P is equal to 600, so I can fill in 600 for P. We're trying to find L, so we don't know what it is, and then we get plus 2 times W, 2 times 50. Okay, we fill in 50 for the W. So now we have an equation that we can solve. Remember, the first step in solving an equation is to simplify anything on either side, and we can actually compute what 2 times 50 is. It's 100. All right. And so now we have an equation. Hopefully you're used to how to solve these. We want to isolate L, so we would start off by subtracting 100 on both sides. Okay, and so we get 500 is equal to 2L. And then to get L isolated, we would divide by 2. And so we get 250 is equal to L. Okay, now as I've cautioned you before, don't stop here. This is a word problem, so we need to answer in words. And so what does L represent? It's the length is, and we don't even stop here. The length is not 250. The length has units. The length is 250 feet. And so that would be the answer to that problem. Okay, so here's a related problem, but it's going to illustrate the importance of applying the correct formula. So we're talking about a rectangle again, but it says it has an area of 200 square feet and a length of 125 feet, and we want to know what its width is. Okay, and so here we're talking about the area of a rectangle. So we're going to use a different formula there. So if you remember from last video, the area of a rectangle is equal to the length times the width. Okay, like that. And now, what are we given? We're given that the area is 200 square feet, so we're given the area is 200, okay? And we're given that the length is 125 feet, okay? And so what are we trying to find here? We find W. So this problem ends up being a little simpler than the last one, but the importance about this example is what formula you use depends on what kind of shape you're talking about and what kind of measurement you're talking about. All right, and so now we fill in 200 for A, and then we fill in 125 for L, and then times W. And so to isolate W now, we divide by both sides by 125, like that. And so we get W is equal to 200 over 125. Like that, that's a fraction that reduces by 25, doesn't it? And so we could, that's going to be 8 over 5. All right. Or if we wanted to go to mixed form, that would be 1 3/5. Okay. And so what would we say here? That the width is 1 3/5 feet. That's a really skinny triangle. Okay, or rectangle. Sorry. So yeah, if you think about that, this rectangle right here is very long. It's 125 feet long, but then it's only 1 3/5 uh, feet wide, so it's a really skinny rectangle. Okay, so let's look at a slightly trickier example here. So a rectangle has a perimeter of 125 feet, and its length, left out an S there, and its length is 10 feet more than its width, and we're going to find the length and the width. Okay, so notice that neither the width or the length are given to us here. Okay, so to get started, make sure you recognize what shape we're talking about. We're talking about a rectangle, and so we have a rectangle, and we're also talking about its perimeter. Okay, and so we're talking about a rectangle's perimeter. And so what formula do we use? We use that P is equal to 2L plus 2W. Okay, now what are we given here? Okay, we're given that P is equal to 125. So that part's pretty straightforward. But see, we're not given either the length or the width, but we are given a piece of information. The length is 10 feet more than its width. So let's write that in words first. Okay, so the length is 10 feet more than the width. Okay, like that. All right, and so the advantage to that is, remember, we've talked about how to translate sentences into math. So that's what we'll do here. What do we have to represent the length? L, and then is by itself, remember, is equals. Okay, 10 feet more than, remember, more than indicates adding. Technically, we should write this as W plus 10. You wouldn't be hurt by writing it as 10 plus W, just because, remember that the order we add things in doesn't matter. Okay, if this were a subtraction phrasing, though, we'd have to be careful about our order. All right, so we have L is equal to W plus 10. Okay, so now here's a big thing in math that some students have trouble with. Okay, so we know that the perimeter is 125. That part's pretty straightforward. Okay, and then we have this 2. Now the thing is this is second piece of information right here. L equals W plus 10. So we have two expressions separated by an equal sign. That means they're the same thing. So whenever we say that two things are equal to each other, that means wherever this is written, we can replace it with this. Just like we did with P. We said P is equal to 125, so we replaced the P with 125. Now L is not equal to a number, but it is equal to W plus 10. So I could fill that in. Just be careful. Writing this will lead you astray, okay? Because 2 is being multiplied by the entire length. And so I need to make sure and include parentheses around that, okay? And then I get plus 2W. All right, and then those parentheses will remind you now, we have an equation now that we can solve. And so those parentheses will remind you that you need to distribute there. So we got 125 is equal to 2W plus 20 plus 2W. All right, and so I'm going to run out of room here, so I'm going to move things up. Oh, come on. There we go. All right, so we have this equation that we can solve. So remember, anytime whenever you're solving, if there's something you can simplify, you always simplify it. Notice that we have 2W plus 2W over there on the right side. And so we have 125 is equal to 4W plus 20. Okay, now I can subtract 20 from both sides. Like that. And so what do we get? 105 is equal to 4W. All right, and then to isolate W, I would divide by 4, like that. And if you do that on your calculator, you're going to get 26 and fourths, right? Or 0.25, sorry, I'm doing that in my head. All right, and so that's what we get for the width. Now, be careful here in answering this problem. So that is telling us that the width is 26.25 feet. So we think we're done with the problem. Always, especially whenever you solve a word problem, go back whenever you think you have the answer and look at what you're trying to find. And see, notice that this problem tells us to find the length and the width. All we've found is the width, so we haven't finished the problem yet. How do we get the length, though? Remember, you can either go back to the wording, the length is 10 feet more than the width, or you can go back to that extra piece of information that we converted into an equation there. And we have L is equal to W plus 10. And so if you go and substitute that in, you'll get 26.25 plus 10, which is 36.25. Okay, so the answer to this problem is the width is 26.25 feet, and the length is 36.25 feet. Like that. And there's the answer to the question, or to the problem. All right, so let's talk a little bit about different shapes. Okay, so let's say a triangle's area is 400. And remember, this means square inches. You can say inches squared. Just make sure you realize that's an area. So a triangle's area is 400 square inches, and its base is 50 inches. And then we want to know what its height is. All right, so key thing is here, now we're talking about a triangle, and we're talking about the area of a triangle. So if you remember that formula from last time, this is 1/2 B times H. Okay, now remember I showed you there was a different form of that. You can think about both of these being over 1 and multiplying, and so it'll make it a little easier to do the algebra here if you can think about this in the alternate form, A equals BH over 2. Okay, so now to solve this problem, what are we given? We're given the area, it's 400, and the base is 50. So the base is equal to 50, like that. And so what are we trying to find? We're trying to find H. All right, and so we can just take our equation, our formula, fill numbers in. A is 400. The base is 50, like that. Now, I was going to show you something here. You might see that you can do 50 divided by 2 there and get 25H. So that's one way to do this. Just to make note of this technique, though, because sometimes these won't divide evenly. Okay. The key thing I wanted to point out here is, notice that I have a fraction over on the right side and I have a whole number over on my left side. But I can write a whole number as a fraction by writing it over 1. What's the advantage to that? That's a proportion. Okay, and so what can we do with proportions? We can equate the cross products. Okay, and so it makes the solving a little bit simpler. So here's my first cross product, and then here's my second cross product right here. And so I can equate those cross products. 400 times 2 is 800, is equal to 1 times 50H. That's just equal to 50H, like that. All right, so now to isolate H, I just divide both sides by 50. Okay, and so what do I get for H there? I get 16. All right, and so again, remember not to stop here. We would say the height is 16 inches. Okay, so actually answer the question in words, and then also make sure to include those units in your answer. Okay, so one more example. Let's look at a volume problem here. So say a circular cylinder has a volume of 1,000. Remember, these are cubic centimeters, or you could say centimeters cubed. Key thing is that's a volume. So it has a volume of 1,000 cubic centimeters and a radius of 10 centimeters. And then we want to find its height rounded to 2 decimal places, and we'll see why in a minute. I have those directions there. Okay, so the key thing is we're talking about a circular cylinder, and we're talking about its volume. Okay, so you might have to look that up. Remember the idea of a circular cylinder. It's basically the shape of a can. So it looks like this. Okay, and so that volume is saying that I could fill that can with 1,000 cubic centimeters. All right, and we know what its radius is. Its radius is 10, and we're just trying to figure out how tall that thing is. All right, so either you hopefully you've learned, or you can have quick access to looking up the formula for the volume of a cylinder. But if you remember that the volume is pi r squared times h. Okay, now the reason I gave you those directions to round is, remember, pi is going to be in the answer, and so we'll end up needing to round it. An important thing about rounding, though, answers, if you're told to round an answer, you wait until the very end of the problem to round it. So you don't want to round pi early. What happens is that you can get some error because of some mathematical oddities that arise. So get the answer in terms of pi, and then at the very end we'll approximate. Okay, but let's worry about that when we get there. So what are we given? We're given that the volume is equal to 1,000, and that r is equal to 10. And then what are we trying to find? We're trying to find the height. Okay, so we take our equation, and we fill in the numbers that we're given. So v is equal to 1,000. Remember, pi is just a number. It's not a variable, so we don't fill anything for it. Okay, r, we're going to square it, though, so we'll have 10 squared, and then times h. Okay, so now remember, we always simplify aside if we can, so we want to do that square first. So we have pi times 100 times h. Okay, so this is one place to warn you about that rounding. It's tempting to plug this in on your calculator right here and then divide by that rounded number. You could get error because of that in your answer. So we just want to hold off. The key thing is what are we trying to do here? We're trying to isolate h. Okay, but what's the problem? H is being multiplied by these two numbers right here. So how do we move those over with the opposite operation? So we divide. So we divide by pi times 100. Now, most people would write that as 100 pi. I'm just trying to keep things as simple as I can and not skip too much. All right, so you could divide by 100 pi also, but I'm just going to stick with pi times 100. All right, so over here they cancel, and so we have our value for h. Okay, so now we are ready to approximate, but you got to be careful. If you plug this in on your calculator like this, like that, it's actually going to give you the wrong answer. Okay. All right. Why is that? Can you think about why that would give you the wrong answer? It's because you're multiplying in that denominator. So you're doing an operation in the denominator. So what do we need to make sure and include whenever we plug that in? We need to make sure and include parentheses down in that denominator. Okay. And whenever you plug that in on your calculator, it gives you 3.18, 309, blah, blah, blah. It gives you more decimal places, but I only said blah, blah, blah because of what did I remember. We're rounding to 2 decimal places. So here's the second decimal place. To see if there's rounding, we look at this number, but that's smaller than 5, so I'm just going to stick with the 3.18. And so the height is about 3.18. Let me point out real quick, too, if you don't use those parentheses on your calculator, the calculator actually gives you 3,183 feet. Or these are centimeters, aren't they? So the calculator actually gives you 3,183 centimeters. And so so that is a very, very different number than what we should have got. Okay, so Hopefully, if you accidentally did that, you'd realize that answer doesn't make any sense anyway. But to finish answering this question, then we'd say the height is, since we approximated, we might want to say approximately 3.18, and in this problem we're talking about centimeters. All right, so that is the answer to this problem. Okay, so I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave the video with that. So the idea, again, to these problems is just identifying the shape that we're talking about and what kind of measure we're talking about, and getting the basic formula for that situation. Okay, and then taking your given information and filling numbers in for that. Sometimes, remember with that rectangle example, sometimes these are algebraic expressions, but filling things in. And then once you have things filled in, you'll have an equation that we've seen how to solve before. And so you'll just progress with the solving for there. And then lastly, remember, being a word problem, we want to answer it in words and make sure to include units in your answers. All right, so I hope that helps. All the best.